Okay, welcome everyone who's joined us for PATIO Conversations, which is the third on the research theme, writing histories today. And we are delighted to have with us speakers Sara Ather from Cornell and Unni from Syracuse. And we have Stephen Legg, who's joining as our respondent in this session from the University of Nottingham. And the session itself is on the research theme we call writing histories. The theme gathers critical reflections upon the nature, practice, and the scope of architectural history. So we ask in this theme whether there are other approaches and areas of focus, such as histories which center more than human beings and things, or environmental histories, subaltern histories, and so on, provide us with the means to push the boundaries of our subdiscipline. The theme seems to further current understandings of how our field is shaped by its historiographical devices, what the stakes of its narratives are. And it could also include engagement with particular terminologies, categories, modes of classification, epistemic frameworks, methods, sources, and approaches. So, in the writing histories theme today, in particular, we will be focusing on the religious politics of architecture. I'm putting it quite broadly, and this is something that has surrounded us and surrounds us today, and it always has historically. It includes much more than what we usually expect, which is what the styles, periods, or forms that describe architecture, and it extends into the very production and the erasures of environment structures and infrastructures. Now, both as phenomena and objects, these structures and infrastructures saturate what we can call our historical present. So, in this session, we'll have Sara speaking about the ritual processes that govern the arc of the Babri Masjid in India's famous demolition and resurrection as the Ram Mandir recently at Ayodhya. And also, Penny will be speaking about the sacred geographies and how they're rewritten by legitimizing large-scale infrastructure structure development of dams along the Narmada pilgrimage routes. Excuse me. So, Yakin will be briefly introducing our speakers, and then Yakin, who is my co-coordinator in this research team, will be introducing the speakers very soon. And we will have both the speakers present their work, and then we will invite Stephen to make his comments and pose any questions he might have to them. Uh, I am also very happy to announce that next month we have the speakers and respondents confirmed for our research theme on tools of building practices. We have Pedro Guedes and Nina Zucchi as speakers, and we have Vibhuti Sachdev joining as the respondent. And the theme will look at the idea of treatises, architectural treatises, both in the pre and post-colonial period in the Indian subcontinent as a tool of building practice. So I just thought I'll announce that in the beginning in case people leave later. So I'll hand over now to Yakin to sort of make the brief introductions, and then we can move on with the session straight away.
Right. Thanks a lot, Satrishi, and thanks for everyone who has joined us today. Um, our first speaker for today's patio session is Sara. Sara is a PhD student in the history of architecture and urban development at Cornell. Her work examines the relationship between architecture and the minoritization of Muslims in post-independence India, particularly under the rise of Hindu nationalism. Um, Sara has, alongside her academic work, she has written as a columnist with essays and commentary appearing in outlets such as Al Jazeera, Middle East Eye, The Wire, and others. After Sara, we have Penny, who is our second speaker for today. Penny is an instructor at Syracuse University School of Architecture. Her research investigates the spatial politics of water infrastructures in South Asia amid ecological degradation, specifically the entanglement of form with myth making. Penny holds a master's from McGill University, and she has worked with multiple architectural firms, and her work has been supported by the Graham Foundation and the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts. With these two speakers, we have Stephen, who is joining us today as the respondent. Stephen Legg is a professor of historical geography at the University of Nottingham. His research focuses on the urban as a multiscalar site for considering political geographies of colonialism, imperialism, internationalism, anti-colonialism, and communalism. His most recent book or monograph includes the 2025 Spaces of Anti-Colonialism, Delhi's Urban Governmentalities by University of Georgia Press. He also serves as the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Historical Geography. So with that, we welcome all of you, the two presenters and our respondent for today, and we're really looking forward to the conversation and the discussions. So I would now ask Sara to share her screen and go ahead with the presentation.
Okay. Hi. Is my screen visible? Okay.
Yep, it's
Okay. Thank you so much, Yakin, for the introduction. Thank you so much to PATIO Network for inviting me. I've been following your work for some time, and it's a real pleasure to be here and to be able to contribute to this conversation. Thank you, Saptarshi and Yakin, for organizing this session, and for Penny and Stephen for joining as co-speaker and respondent, and also everyone else who has taken time out of their busy schedules to come here and to listen to us. So I'll dive straight into my work. So my paper is tentatively titled Architecture of Fascism, Sacred Labor and the Demolition of Babri Mosque. Throughout the sessions, I'll be using some words that are in Hindi. So I'm just giving a brief translation for people who do not understand Hindi. So I'll be using the words like seva a lot. Seva means service. Kar means hand, and seva means service. So manual service. Sevak is the one who serves, and shila means brick or stone. I'd like to start with this image. This is an image of Karsevaks on the 5th of December, 1992, a day before the planned demolition of the 16th century Babri Mosque in Ayodhya, Uttar Pradesh. Thousands of men had traveled from across India to perform Karseva at the site of the existing mosque, here understood quite literally as the act of demolition carried out by one's own hands. Lined up in a tightly ordered row, the young and middle-aged men stand shoulder to shoulder with tools gripped at a similar height in a disciplined, queued formation. The axes and sledgehammer they hold read almost as extension of their arms, literalizing the etymology of karseva, that is, the hand in service. Now, because these are also standard implements of masonry and foundation work, the image kind of blurs the distinction between building and unbuilding, casting demolition as the first architectural act of a future Ram temple imagined in the place of the existing mosque. A crucial point here is that the photographer, Praveen Jain, entered the premises through a privileged connection with one of the leaders of the movement. Hence, the image is not simply an organic representation of what happened before the demolition, but is also a self-authored visualization of how the movement wanted itself to be seen and to be remembered. Now, a massive force of workers certainly did not spring up spontaneously in December 1992. It was painstakingly assembled over at least a decade through a series of design campaigns and processions organized under the broader umbrella of Hindu nationalist organizations. However, the primary motive that informed these campaigns were not simply a religious message, but a sustained architectural imagination that offered a framework for binding dispersed participants into a single consolidated identity. In its own account of December 2016, the RSS Mouthpiece newspaper organizer describes their campaigns as follows. Gradually, the movement started gaining attention. It was decided that a temple should be constructed there, and temple architects were also consulted. But before the construction of the temple could take place, it was required to inform everyone that this temple will be constructed with the help of crores of Hindus, crores meaning millions. It was decided that the Hindu society would move to Ayodhya and will start the construction work, that is the Karseva, with their own hands. A police officer asked one of the people in the VHP office, "What kind of announcement have you made? You know, when the police will start firing, none of these people will stay there." And he received a response, "You know nothing about the Sevaks of the sun. If one will die, the other one will follow. If the second one will die, the third one will move ahead with the flag." I don't think that the police officer would have ever met anybody who said things like this. Now, the newspaper account illustrates how the movement retrospectively narrated itself as a drama of martyrdom, characterized by collective bodily sacrifice in the service of the temple's construction. Critical in this self-description is also the fact that the text frames the Ayodhya campaign as a temple building movement and not a demolition drive. The rhetorical sequence shows that the organizers wanted the event to be remembered as a gigantic voluntary construction site, with the Babri Mosque reduced to a mere obstacle in the way of an already imagined Ram temple. The passage also constructs a very specific subject of the labor, that is the Sevaks, whose defining trait is their willingness to die in sequence. In the history of independent India, the demolition of the Babri Mosque is widely seen as a pivotal event that transformed the country's political landscape, marking the spectacular return of the far-right Hindu nationalist movement. The destruction of the mosque triggered months of communal violence across India, with large-scale riots and attacks on homes and places of worship in several cities, leaving at least 2,000 dead, the majority of them, of course, Muslims. These images does press another important questions. Who are these Karsevaks, these thousands of Karsevaks, willing to risk their bodies for the construction of Ram Temple? While Seva, as a selfless service, has a long history in religious as well as secular contexts, including anti-colonial organizing in the early 20th century, the formation of Karsevaks as a mass demolition force is specific to the late 20th century Hindu nationalist movement. I pursue this question by shifting the attention from the single day of demolition at Babri to a longer history of labor reorganized in the wake of mill closures across India. In particular, I track how amid neoliberal restructuring since the 1970s, an unsettled landscape of work and pre-existing idioms of seva were gradually refashioned into a sacred workforce of Karsevaks through mass processions and campaign forms orchestrated by emerging right-wing forces. A central element in this history is the differentiated inclusion of Dalit or untouchable bodies into the temple construction labor force. Historically, in temple economies, the right to serve or even touch the sacred interior is mapped directly onto caste hierarchies, admitting the pure inside while relegating those marked as polluting to the outside. To unpack how this order is being reworked, I return to the Hindu nationalist models of temple as an instrument of social re-engineering developed by key ideologues of the movement. Moving back to the foundations of Hindu nationalism, we see that the 20th century Hindutva ideologues were deeply invested in creating a reformed subject of Hindu identity that could essentially work around the divisions of caste and offer a methodology to consolidate caste into one racialized totality of the Hindu essence. Thus, the term Hindutva, Hindu meaning Hindu, and Tattva meaning essence. Efforts to loosen these caste boundaries did not remain at the level of abstract rhetoric. Early ideologues actively sought out architectural means of reconfiguring who could appear inside the temple and on what terms. One of the most influential among them, Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, turned the temple itself into a site of social experiment. His projects, most notably the Patit Pavan Mandir at Ratnagiri, built between 1929 to 1931, staged Dalit or untouchable inclusion as a carefully controlled reform, simultaneously advertising a language of caste transcendence and subsuming the Dalit bodies within the majoritarian Hindu fold. This was, of course, not an egalitarian movement. It answered to the political calculus of that time, in which consolidating a Hindu majority required incorporating Dalit populations, lest oppositional political formations appear more unified. Temple construction thus became a laboratory for a new model of seva in which Dalit participation was welcomed, but only under the sign of Hindu unity and upper caste leadership. On the surface, then, Patit Pavan Mandir appears as a radical break, the first temple in India, or as its advocates would insist, to institutionalize unrestricted Dalit access to the inner shrine. Yet, its rhetoric of purification implicitly cast Dalit devotees as prior pollutants, now rendered fit for worship. This reworked notion of seva also emerged against the backdrop of Gandhian labor ethics in the late 1920s and 30s, when organizations like the Harijan Sevak Sangh, which was founded in 1932, were created explicitly to eliminate untouchability. In this Gandhian mode, seva was typically imagined as service by upper caste volunteers who would construct wells and temples to serve the Harijans, or the outcasts, as repentance of the sins of the Hindu history, with an ethical drama again centered around the upper caste sevak, who through these acts of care sought to redeem both himself and the Hindu community rather than ceding power to Dalit initiative. By contrast, the Hindutva reconfiguration of seva displays this asymmetry, where Dalits were not just recipients of service, but became the very agents of sacred work, mobilized for projects, and later, as we shall see, for campaigns like Ayodhya. After the Indian independence of 1947, urban labor histories further shaped the ground on which this transformation occurred. In many industrial towns, mill neighborhoods brought together workers across caste and religious lines, generating fragile but significant solidarities rooted in shared class position and union organization. Within these neighborhoods, a culture of seva developed around local committees and representatives who organized repairs, festivals, or welfare activities, and in exchange, they would accrue political loyalty. The collapse of the mills around from the late 1970s onward destabilized these configurations. As mills closed down and union structures weakened, workers who had once been knit together by industrial labor found themselves unemployed, or at least precariously employed. It is precisely into this landscape of loss and anxiety that organizations like Vishwa Hindu Parishad inserted themselves as recruiting organizations. Neighborhoods with high concentrations of unemployed youths were targeted and were offered small but tangible forms of assistance, which included help in securing odd jobs or mediation with local authorities. They also promised new roles within the emergent Hindu nationalist campaigns. At the same time, especially during the 80s in cities like Ahmedabad and Mumbai, as several scholars as Jean Briman and Rukmani Barua have shown, there was an active effort to recruit Dalit youth, extending to them a sense of recognition and moral worth that the shattered industrial order no longer provided. The idiom of seva was again crucial here. What had earlier been service to the neighborhood or to the working class was gradually redirected as service to the Hindu nation and to its sacred sites. Duty within processions and rallies substituted for older roles in union committees or mill-based welfare associations. In this shift, architecture again became a privileged medium. The promise held out was not only of material employment, but equally of participating in building a new temple and by extension, a new nation. Over the course of the late 1980s and early 90s, this logic crystallized in a series of campaigns like the Ek Mata Yatra, the Rath Yatra, and crucially, the Shilapujan ceremony that rehearsed both symbolically and logistically the mobilization that later condensed in the figure of the Karsevak at Ayodhya. As a key mobilization strategy, the Ramshila campaign was deployed by the Hindu nationalist organizations as part of their broader campaigns to construct a Ram temple. This event served as a ritualistic innovation of uniting Hindu communities across caste and classes across India. Between 1989 and 92, the Ramshila Puja was organized on a national scale, where the VHP divided the country into zones, sent cadres door to door to collect a brick from each household, and had each one inscribed with Rama's name. The bricks were then gathered at regional sites and ritually consecrated and installed in public spaces as temporary idols, binding everyday homes to the projected Ram temple. An important archival image from the movement is that of the 1989 foundation laying ceremony at Ayodhya, foregrounding the Dalit activist Rameshwar Chaupal, performing the Shilanaya ritual whilst being seated among religious and political leaders, foregrounding the Ram Janambhoomi movement's strategic use of low caste participation in sacred labor. Even though the project remains firmly upper caste in its authorship and command structure, this controlled redistribution of sacred labor allowed Hindu nationalists to present itself as caste transcending, while in fact reinscribing hierarchy in a new form. From an architectural perspective, this is the very script that was first tested at Patit Pavan Mandir, where the temple was conceived as a device to rearrange bodies, thresholds, and sightlines so that Dalits are placed at the visible center of ritual work, while upper caste actors retain control over the building. Another key image from the Ramshila campaign comes from July 1992, again during a foundation laying ceremony on a newly acquired land for the Ram temple near the Babri Mosque. This image is taken from an elevated vantage point, and the photograph centers around a large excavation site ringed in tight concentric tiers by Karsevaks and spectators. The deep, empty pit reads as an absent foundation, while the densely packed bodies around it form provisional superstructure, so that for the moment, the temple appears to be made not of stone, but of people. Seen together, these images and practices suggest that the Ramshila campaign did more than symbolically anticipate a future temple. It began to reorganize people, space, and labor, as well as the territorial imagination in recognizably architectural ways. Considering its modern modes of organization and caste inclusion, the Ram Temple project unsettles the familiar story in which religion and secularism simply oppose each other as irrational particularity versus rational universality. Read alongside the evidentiary and disciplinary contests around Ayodhya, the temple appears as a modern technology for organizing bodies and authorizing claims to the past through techniques of publicity and mass participation. If we now return finally to the image with which I began, we can see these histories condensing in the figure of the Karsevak. His sacred labor cannot be just written off as a survival of some form of pre-modern piety. It is a very deliberately fashioned practice that combines both volunteering and risk-taking that functions together as an apparatus to convert economic precarity and wounded aspirations of a disenfranchised youth into a language of self-service and historical rectification. Following Talal Asad, secularism can be understood as a set of practices that define boundaries, affects, and forms of knowledge appropriate to religion in modern life. The Ayodhya case shows Hindu nationalism working within that field rather than simply rejecting it, invoking temple construction as heritage work and presenting caste-inclusive seva as a form of ethical citizenship rather than fanaticism. What we see emerging is, in fact, a new mode of secularity in which the temple is authorized as both religious and national, and sacred labor is reframed as a modern practice of discipline and risk. The campaign extended architecture beyond the finished building into a dispersed apparatus of training, circulation, and display, translating sacred work into a mode of modern political practice. The Ram Temple is therefore less of a triumph of religion over secularism than the crystallization of a new configuration in which both are remade. It is an architectural device through which a racialized Hindu national body anchors its claim both in labor and spatial form, so that on the eve of demolition, a line of men with hammers could not just stand as a crowd, but as the visible edge of a carefully engineered sacred labor force. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sara. That was fascinating. Without any further delay and also very well kept to time, I'm going to invite Penny to make her presentation, and then we can move to Stephen for the comments. Penny, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Can you see my screen? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you to Patio, Saptarshi, Yakin, Sarah, and Stephen. Thank you for having me and for the conversations afterwards. In our present-day maps, the Narmada River flows from its source westwards across the states of Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, and Gujarat to empty into the Arabian Sea. As described in the Skanda Puranas, a major Hindu text, the cosmology of the Hindu world is transposed to the specifics of the Narmada River. The close of a past cosmic time cycle brought to Earth an incurable drought and famine, relieved only when deities appealed to the god Shiva, who entered a deep state of concentration, and from his sweat flowed the holy river Narmada, reborn as his daughter, quenching the land of its thirst. There are many versions of the river's origin, from the Puranas to folklore, all of which establish Narmada's purity and sacredness. As a river, it is the idol of Mother Goddess. As a deity, it is subject to and giver of blessings, and as a temple, it is circumambulated in pilgrimage. This sacrosanctity gives way to one of the world's largest river valley waterworks schemes of over 3,000 dams for irrigation, flood control, and hydroelectricity. It spans many decades. Nehru, who famously called dams the temples of modern India, laid the foundation stone for the largest of the Narmada dams, the Sardar Sarovar, whose construction was repeatedly halted until 2017 when Modi took office and spearheaded its completion. As much as the river's mythopoetic origins, the dams that interrupt its flow have been debated for decades for their spanning of state policies, socio-ecological impacts, displacement of millions of farmers and forest tribes, and the grassroots movements that have emerged in response. But the dams have been indifferently ignored by the general Indian public, and more interestingly, embraced by major religious groups, which for other reasons stage violent riots resulting in bloodshed. Religion and culture, often so violently defended and promoted, have here in the Narmada Valley been quietly traded to serve political agendas. Saints and leaders of Hindu organizations lead major public rituals to sanctify dam construction. And while on the other hand, the tribal community elders, whose lives are intimately bound by the river and forced to leave its banks, say, "What can a river do if Narmada Mother wants to be dammed?" Naturalizing the mechanization as divine will, masking the political realities beneath a layer of spiritual surrender. There are many myths and legends told of every bend and curve of the river's length. They overlay the Narmada with millions of tirthas, which represent the locative strand of Hindu piety, where ritual and reverence are linked primarily to place. Such places, often marked by geographical specificity, be it the mouth or a notable meander, are reinforced by myths and consecrated as pilgrimage sites. Thousands of pilgrims walk along the Narmada in the Narmada Parikrama, barefoot with an alms bowl from one sacred tirtha to the next. The rules require one to walk on either side of the riverbank, keeping the water on your right side, never crossing the river until reaching the sea at its very end before returning upstream. The Narmada River has been circumambulated in this way since at least the 6th century, its route canonized in Sanskrit texts. Now that the dams and its canal systems and reservoirs have drastically changed the river's ecological and physical form, submerged much of the valley, and extended the route by some 400 kilometers, pilgrims walk a considerably altered path. But these rules, ancient and aesthetic, have been simply adapted such that the waters of a canal or man-made reservoir are not considered the waters of Narmada and therefore can be permissibly crossed. All this has had little effect on the popularity of the pilgrimage or the perception of pilgrims who worship the stagnant waters of the reservoirs just like the flowing waters of the original river. Somehow, submergence of sacred places has not brought about its desacralization. But rather, as the river becomes an engineered landscape, it functions as much for placemaking as place disrupting. Because so many holy sites or tirthas have been submerged, this has necessitated the establishment of new tirthas, new temples, new lodges to maintain infrastructure for ever-increasing numbers of pilgrims. State governments, who have failed to resettle millions of people, have instead planned the development of new religious places where their homes and villages once stood, and in doing so have increasingly marked the valley as a uniformly Hindu space, in a way concretizing the dominance of Hindu influence. These new constructed tirthas occupy the symbolic and physical space of the river to formalize the notion of the valley as an exclusively sacred geography. The state-led interest in the pilgrimage has inspired new types of routes in which politicians conduct air yatras flying up the length of the river in private planes, the development of a cruise from the Sardar Dam to Omkareshwar at the midpoint, and the Madhya Pradesh government plans to build a multi-state Narmada expressway to circumambulate the river by car or bus. What I find interesting is how a religious rite, long upheld as ancient in origin and grounded in humble tradition, is actively shaped to serve the logic of the modern market-driven world order. We can understand hydroelectric landscapes as mutable, dynamic, contested, and able to embody different political agendas. It is how the river can be home to millions of holy tirthas, as well as thousands of dams, and still be sacred, or how the same government that advances the dam building project also loudly venerates the river's sacrosanctity, or how both pro-dam and anti-dam actors position the Narmada as pure mother goddess, sharing the same rhetoric to uphold vastly different ideologies. Perhaps this is because space figures so prominently in the Hindu nationalist imagination, and this mythologized geography of tirthas is projected onto contested hydroelectric landscapes, encoding these spaces in the image of Hinduness, transforming dams, much like sacred rivers or temples, into territorial markers of the Hindu politic. The contradiction emerges when either political party in the states of Gujarat and Madhya Pradesh loudly support their mega dams in some locations and protest others when not in power. In other words, dam building is a way of doing politics. The RSS, the organization which largely promotes the ideology of Hindutva, has deployed exclusionary religious rhetoric to resist damming in famous cases like the Tehri Dam, and somehow organized the protests of the submergence of temples in Omkareshwar. However, its political wing, the BJP, has been the biggest builder of Narmada's dams, and they've made the building of dams into a kind of religious spectacle. Major rituals are conducted with priests when a dam or canal is opened. The Narmada dams are famously supported by the Hindu denomination BAPS, whose leader said of the Sardar Sarovar Dam, "The project will be completed. The dam height should not be decreased by even 1 inch. Like the river Ganga, the Narmada is holy and sacred." Modi claimed in the speech delivered at the Sardar's completion that once the World Bank pulled out of the project, it was in fact Gujarati temples that paid for its construction in the end. He paints anti-dam people as unpatriotic, and that in the obstructions created by forces against Narmada project, Mother Narmada has suffered the most. Through this rhetoric, the myth of Narmada's origin returns. She flows from Shiva's sweat to relieve the earth of famine and drought. The engineering of her flow is destined to quench the land of its thirst, in Modi's speech. While scriptures describe the river as Jivan Dhyani, life giver, BJP politicians call the Sardar Dam as Jiva Dori, lifeline. From this perspective, it's less the river than the dam that is sacred, as the government claims the dam will turn the drought-prone state of Gujarat into Nandana Vanaman, referencing the Indra's abundant celestial garden. Between priests and the BJP, the pro-dam agenda utilizes symbolic systems propelled by vocabularies of pride, unity, nation-building through mythopoetic narrative and motifs. In 2004 and 2017, the BJP party organized the Narmada Mahotsav Yatra, a kind of government reinterpretation of pilgrimage, in which the Narmada goddess is carried in a chariot across thousands of villages, extensively used as a pre-election campaign to showcase infrastructural development, and link it to worship in the public consciousness by following the original Narmada Parikrama route. Dam-related events also deployed the spectacle of water, deliberately depleting water storage in Madhya Pradesh and withholding its release to build up reservoir levels in Gujarat, only for the gates to be thrown open all at once, transforming the act of hydraulic management into a manufactured drama of the river's power. So religion creeps into the Narmada issue and makes itself most present in the pilgrim town of Omkareshwar in Madhya Pradesh. The town and its upstream dam are both included as part of the National Prashad Scheme, which stands for Pilgrimage, Rejuvenation, and Spiritual Heritage Augmentation Drive, establishing the main temple as a holy pilgrim site and officially the dam as part of its tourism scheme. This is arguably the most important tirtha along the Narmada, and it's where the pilgrim walker must end their journey. On the island, Mandata is a Jyotirlinga temple, of which there are 12 in India. It's a tirtha where Shiva appeared as a column of light, and a lingam, his conical idol representation, appeared as a self-manifested form, meaning it's been there since the beginning of time. The lingam is worshipped by ablution, and it's believed that the river flows under the island to keep level the water surrounding the lingam, no matter how much liquid is poured. Perhaps this is what a Hindu priest at the main Omkareshwar temple meant when he said, "The dam uses the water to make power, but it can't take all the power from the river. All we need is a trickle." 1 kilometer upstream of the Jyotirlinga temple, the eponymous Omkareshwar Dam was built in 2007. It's one of the few canceled World Bank dam projects due to having no resettlement plan or environmental clearance. Omkareshwar, being of such importance to the religion, is a historic city that struggles to mediate the two disparate conceptions of the world, with the Narmada River and its political instrumentation at the center. The dam turned a pious territory into a landscape of extraction, and it's responsible for both extreme flooding during monsoons, droughts during dry seasons, and has affected river-based rituals. The case of Omkareshwar shows us the priority of the state-created organization, NHDC, the Narmada Hydroelectric Development Corporation, whose logo means "lead us from darkness to light," as they have done little to rehabilitate displaced villagers or a forest submerged land, but they've worked extensively with the dam builders, JP Associates, to restore the Jyotirlinga temple, which tragically included covering up the original medieval facade and with a 5-story access ramp covering original rock surfaces with plaster and paint, and leaving the temple, which has supposedly existed since the creation of the world, with a disturbingly modern appearance. Through the act of cosmic map-making, myth comes to replicate geological fact in Omkareshwar. The shape of the island is believed to be the Devanagari letter and cosmic symbol Om, hence Omkareshwar, and has inspired its own pilgrimage route on the island. This has affirmed the religious importance of the place as a tourist destination and has created an imagined landscape more culturally powerful than any real or precise map. We see this new mythical map recreated in AI by social media, posted by state government, tourist departments, as well as press journals. The mural produced by the NHDC, the Narmada Hydroelectric Development Corporation, on the tourist entry point to the Omkareshwar Dam, shows the Narmada and its major tirthas and also its biggest dams. In maps that show the gods and goddesses behind these myths, we see the dams appear such that the island is reimagined in this manner, and the dam is included as part of the venerated landscape, grouped together in the same holy plane, the same plane of holy vision. Pilgrims enjoy boat rides to see the dam gates or walk the island route, and they are constantly confronted with the image of the dam. It becomes a celebrated destination in its own right, featured on the temple website, painted and lit up in the colors of India's flag, and has a powerhouse of a distinctly temple-like architecture, unique to the powerhouses of any other of the Narmada dams. The island is also shaped by the Narmada to the south and the tributary Kaveri to the north, and the confluence of the two, the Kaveri Singam, is a highly worshipped site as a tirtha. Since the tributary itself was submerged, the dam now represents the confluence in concrete form, therefore meriting its own kind of worship. This seems to be a storytelling tool told to pilgrims on boat rides, that this is where the object where the Kaveri and Narmada now meet. Geological processes are further reinterpreted by myth through the production of stone lingams. The belief is that the goddess Narmada asked Shiva to live in every stone and rock within her waters. At Omkareshwar, conical lingams once acquired their shape naturally from a waterfall that's since been submerged. And today, river stones with suitable shapes are ground and polished and then distributed to sell on the roadside, pretending to be the same self-manifested forms. But with the popular held belief that every stone in the river is a Shiva lingam and anything made of them is sacred, we could say that Shiva himself was crushed 1,000,000 times, ground into a powder, and cast into the dam walls. What makes the Narmada Valley so revealing is how sacredness is inseparable from geography, and then on top of it, localizing piety. It is, in this setting, a political instrument that consecrates ground as specifically and exclusively Hindu, where mythopoetic placemaking and nation-making collapse into a single act. The same logic also allows the state to do multiple things at once: pursuit of an aggressively modernizing program under the pressures of post-colonial nation building in the forms of hydroelectricity, irrigation, expressway building, while simultaneously advancing a Hinduizing vision of the nation where the dam becomes the device where modernization is performed as devotion. If the land is holy and the engineering of the river is the fulfillment of Mother Narmada's will, then the millions unresettled, the submerged forests, the destabilized banks, the desecrated and replastered temples cannot easily be named as harm at all. To object is to obstruct the goddess, to be, in Modi's words, unpatriotic. Displacement and ecological degradation are rendered unspeakable, folded out of the register of policy and into the register of faith. Nation building becomes an uncontestable religious duty. Thank you.
Thank you, Penny, for that fascinating talk again. I think before anything else, I'd like to invite Stephen to make his initial comments on both the speakers' presentations and also offer, pose any questions you might have. So, Stephen, thank you. You're welcome.
Sure, thank you. So I haven't seen these papers before. So like everyone, I think my mind's racing from these two incredible presentations. I'm a geographer, I'm an historical geographer, but I'm primarily trained in geography. But often I meet historians or architectural historians who make me feel not very geographical, especially Penny. This is proper geography. So I'll go in the order they were presented and just give some thoughts and reflections. Sara's paper was so well timed. I'm currently trying to finish a book. I'm thinking about the emergence of communalism in Delhi in the 30s and the 40s. And I've just revisited, because of his sad demise, Ken Panikar's work from the early 90s. And I've been re-engaging with scholarship produced at the time of the demolition of the Babri Masjid, and just realizing how acute so many of these historians were at the time. And what they were doing at the time was trying to articulate what had changed from the 19th century through the 20s and the 30s to the 90s. And it was really interesting revisiting the analytics they picked up at the time. So Ken Panikar basically argues that a sort of colonial model of scholarship argued there was a distinction between lower class and middle class forms of communalism, one of which is constitutional, and the other of which was what's called sort of spasmodic, so the riot versus the campaign. And in the same edited book, Communalism in India, there's a fascinating chapter by Suranjan Das, where he argues that before the 1940s, communal violence tended to revert to class-based violence. So there'd be a music for mosque or there'd be a procession, but actually they'd target the landlords and then it would stop. Whereas after the 40s, you get the riot, which is going back to that ideal of the spasmodic. But in both of those, there's the sense that the lower classes are directed. And in that sense, it becomes quite similar to the Cambridge school. The working classes are either paid to do something, or constitutionalism reaches into them and politicizes them. And I suppose with the sort of subaltern studies hat on, the thing I get a little uncomfortable in the communal literature is that what the subaltern studies taught us is to not presume the subaltern is pre-political. But what seems to come up in a lot of that literature is the assumption is that the subaltern is pre-communal, like they need to be communalized. And therefore they're victims, and they're actually very lacking agency here. But there's no doubt, as you say, that these masses of people are viewed as a workforce in the economic sense, in the sense of the voluntary service. So I suppose my question to you is, how do you grapple with this question of structure, in very 1980s terminology, structuring versus agency? These figures are clearly being targeted, but to view them only as the mobilized is to strip them of the capacity to be communal. So my first question, I suppose, is when you look at these projects on the ground, which to me are the most effective way to address these questions, it's the classic subaltern question. I mean, do we know what these, did people ask these workers? Were they arrested? Did they give testimonies? Did they write memoirs? Did they give journal interviews? Where's their voice, and how do we factor this into your amazing articulation of these figures and bringing us closer to this question of whether it's a sort of ideological saturation or whether people have actually just been informed and look at their world and decide that this is an ideology they want to sign up to. The second question I had was some really interesting parallels that emerged in your presentation. Not thinking about parallels with historical communalism, but parallels with Gandhian nationalism, which is obviously not usual, but you talk about martyrdom. And I don't think people tend to associate Hindutva with martyrdom. It's about attack, it's about defense. But to be a martyr is something usually associated with a sort of external Islamic sacrifice, or Gandhi. So Gandhi's sense that non-violence is all about death. Faisal Devji's argued that Gandhi's fundamentally about violence, but it's dictating people to open themselves up to violence rather than to enact it. But also, of course, most famously in 1932, Gandhi's very aggressive claiming back of Harijans, as he called them, and absolutely not accepting that they can be separated from the Hindu body constitutionally. So I was interested, obviously Gandhi is a problematic figure for the BJP, as he was for the RSS. So I was interested in how you think Gandhi gets figured here as precursor and as a symbol. So I was fascinated by that presentation. Just a few questions and comments there for you. Penny, this is such interesting work. I'm mainly sort of familiar with these debates about dams actually through the work of Erik Svingedal, who's worked on dams in fascist Spain, and thinking about these very complex questions, which again sort of thwart our assumptions about environmentalism, about renewable energy, and about the way in which the route to that is often through this sort of techno dominance. I was interested in the way in which you raised the question of the infrastructure and the infrastructural. Again, another urban geographer, Abdul Malik Simone, I don't know if you know of his work, who's encouraged us to think about infrastructures beyond the material and thinking of infrastructures as both material, as human in terms of laborers, and performative in terms of moments. And I've always struggled with the utility of that work. And when you were talking, it just came together so clearly. These ceremonies offering sanctity to these dams, the rerouting and the creating of new mobilities and pilgrimage sites through this landscape was just fascinating to me. So I've only really got two questions. One is a sort of peculiar one, but I think it hopefully makes sense. And that's to continue to think of dams as 3D spaces. We tend to map them and they become areas. But of course, there's still 3D spaces in which the things which are flooded continue to exist and may well, depending upon the flow of water, become visible. So I suppose my question was, given the sacredness of the water, what happens to the sacredness of sites that become submerged? And does the water enable a connection with those sites in a way that can't happen with other religions? So I live in Nottingham in the Midlands, and there was a series of similar damming projects in the 30s. And when the water goes down, you can still see the top of a church spire, famously in the Peak District. But there's no sense of it being a religious site at all. The graves were exhumed, it was desacralized, it's gone. But given the fact that many of these sites were there because they reference belief that deities were active in these sites thousands of years ago, and that the water is sacred, is it so consequential that the sites are submerged if the water allows a form of connection with those sites, which I don't think you get in other religions? So how is submersion here different or not to other sites? And the second sort of thought was this fascinating question of the anti-national. So Arundhati Roy obviously is the first person I thought about when I thought about campaigning here, and I wonder, I wonder if she sort of hypercharged this association of the anti-Dam with the anti-national, but also presumably there will be figures on the more orthodox branches of Hinduism, of Hindu right, and again, in terms of Sarah's work, the RSS and the BJP are always trying to consolidate the homogeneity of the Hindu and the Hindu right, when in fact, of course, there are Sanatanists and Orthodox groups which still resist RSS interpretations. Is there resistance to the idea that you can force this sacred water through a dam, that you can channelize it, that you can monetize it? If the electricity is felt to be a product of Shiva's presence in the water, are there branches of Hindu civil society, Hindu politics that continue to resist the idea that you should use a deity in this way? So just a few opening comments, but thank you so much for these deeply geographical presentations.
Thank you so much, Steve. I'd invite any of you to respond, whoever wants to go first.
Maybe I can go. Thank you so much, Stephen. There are such great queries. I have also been really thinking about it. I wouldn't say I have clean answers, but I have also been thinking about these questions, especially when it comes to this question of pre-communal identity. And actually, my paper or my work wants to argue in opposition to that. I don't want to say that this is about religion, and this is what I very persistently argue in the paper. I see this project more in terms of race making or a racializing project. And because what I'm seeing here is, of course, there are these modernized processes, modernized campaigns, modernized mass participation campaigns that are being created to create this new consciousness, which does not already exist. This is something that is being actively fabricated. And that's why we see that a lot of the rhetoric here cannot strictly fall into the category of religion. Because if it is religion, why are they interested in the secular rhetorics of heritage politics, for instance, or technology in itself is very much deployed in how mass participation happens in these campaigns. This argument about the subject being pre-communal is something that I anyway do not really agree with, and I want to see how a new form of racial hierarchy is being installed through these Hindu nationalist campaigns. Now, also the question of agency, again, is also very complicated, I would say, because there is a very controversial term that is often used for the lower caste workers, especially, who have been part of these campaigns or even have been part of riots. The term is called foot soldiers, and I do not ascribe to that term, but again, what that term does is it sort of kills the question of agency, as if these people are only being dragged into this without any knowledge of what they're getting into. And this is where I bring in the comparison of the Gandhian model, where I think that there is something radical that the Hindu nationalists are doing, and not in a good way, but that they are giving them agency in a way, that they are allowing them to become decision makers in this movement, and also giving them some form of material support that the former regimes or former governments have not been able to provide. So there is something really complicated here, both on the question of communalism and agency, as you have brought up. And again, with the question about the parallels with Gandhi and how he fits into it, Gandhi was a very difficult figure for the RSS and the Hindu nationalists, but he was also a complicated figure for Ambedkar, for instance, and for Ambedkarite organizations in general. So this participatory model where the Harijan is included, but is included as someone whose inclusion is basically supposed to work as some form of is going to do work for the upper caste sevak, who's going to redeem himself of the sins through the inclusion of this worker, which is also to me a form of passive model, I would say. And so the question around Gandhi is also something that I am still sort of struggling with, and it's something that I have to work more to really situate him in my project where he stands. But yeah, these are really good questions, and I'm so glad you asked me. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And Penny, before you come in, I just want to tell our audience that if you have any questions, either raise your hands or Yakin and I have one eye on the chat, so you can please post them to our speakers. Thanks, Penny.
Yeah. Thank you, Stephen, for the comments. I will first, I think, talk about your first comment about dams as 3D spaces, or rather what happens when the flooding occurs, what's left in the land that is turned into a reservoir that was once, a village with its own set of tirthas and its own relevance. I think that was one of the kind of introductory questions for me, in the sense of how do you negotiate this piece of geography, this long river that has both thousands of dams and thousands of holy places, and somehow the pilgrimage of this route seems to have continued and is more and more popular than ever. And that submergence hasn't really brought about a degree of desacralization that may be inherent to the nature of those doing the pilgrimage or those worshiping these sites. The kind of tops of temple roofs sticking out of the reservoirs is a common scene, especially in monsoon season. And some of these sites have been relocated, which is, I think, one of the interesting aspects of this kind of rebranding of the sacred geography, in that previously the Narmada Valley has been one of the more tribal centers of central India, in which there's doesn't quite reflect the hegemonic Hindu worship we see elsewhere. There's much more, let's say, variety in terms of types of deities, in terms of types of temples, specific to from village to village, rather than the kind of larger celebrated names, the kind that the government would be building for now. So when this emergence of these smaller localized deity temples occurs, and the NHDC or the government makes this kind of performance of rebuilding it or relocating it, it's often done in a fairly strategic way. It's moved some 50 kilometers from its original location to be on the site of the dam, to be kind of coupled with the rest of the tourist activity, or the deity itself. It loses its specificity. Maybe it keeps its name, but it no longer has the images, those are submerged, of whatever original statue had been underwater. It's just the fact of kind of hegemonizing the kind of worship of the religion. And then on the kind of coupling of the anti-dam actor and the anti-national, yeah, there are figures on the more orthodox side, and I was able to find these in reports and texts, but it's certainly on the quieter end. I think the branches of Hindu politics that resist it aren't as loud or loud enough, which has maybe been the story of this entire Narmada damming. There has been a group of saints, sadhus, who have been associated with the BJP party and with the RSS as their kind of designated saints, that are on the dam premises when these big worship rituals are being performed, politically televised, paid great amounts of money. And the dam issues actually inspired a kind of movement among the saints who voiced frustration with the BJP party for this kind of contradictory nature of having to do puja ritual to a river at the site of its ruin. But this is, a fairly quieter, resisting voice. And I think the irony is in that there's a degree of acceptance of the quote of like, what can the human do if the Narmada mother wants to be damned? And that vision is kind of shared by, I would say, many saints. And it's a kind of example of how dispossession or how desacralization is articulated, that all these political realities are still masked under spiritual surrender, and able to be accepted, I think. So that, yeah.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody, Sara, Penny, and Stephen for your contributions. We have a little bit of time left, and we can probably take about 2 or 3 questions before we conclude the session. So if anyone has any questions, please. Sara, I can see your hand raised. Yeah.
Yeah, it's I don't really have a question, but it's more sort of a comment, I think. But first of all, thank you for these 2 wonderful presentations. I think they talk to each other also. They speak to each other very well. I was just wondering, thinking about the Bhumi Puja ceremony itself and the way it reflects in your pictures as a very prominent political tool as well, in the way it's mediatized. And then thinking back on the smaller Bhumi Puja ceremonies in a house where, or when you're building a smaller building where you're actually, I think the idea is to kind of apologize almost for disturbing the land. And so did you find that the Bhumi Puja, I'm just wondering, is that the most prominent ritual, or are there other rituals which a lot during the life of the dam create other, let's say, political milestones, or are there other celebrations which are used in the same way, or is the Bhumi Puja really a kind of critical moment here, which is, I mean, also in the way politicians almost fight over opening a new infrastructural project and claiming the credit for it. So how, and do you have any thoughts on that, maybe?
Yeah, it is definitely an ongoing thing. And it is made a kind of spectacle in that way. Like I briefly mentioned that water is, then used as a tool as part of the drama of the puja, held back famously on Modi's birthday. So they'll deplete all the water in Madhya Pradesh so they can fill the reservoir levels of Sardar Dam, which has been the more kind of publicized one in the last few years, and then release it all at once. So it becomes this kind of spectacle when the puja is happening. And so the pujas are generally done, to consecrate or celebrate the dam being opened or a canal being opened, but also pretty much any point in the water cycle of the year, because the dams are only exacerbating the vagaries of monsoons, right? So we have even more worse and unpredictable flooding, even more worse and unpredictable droughts. And so this is where the kind of religious figure comes back again, invited to the dam to kind of publicly show some effort of Narmada Puja, of like asking the river to, or asking the dam to replenish her waters or to stop the flooding. They're not all, equally televised, but I think it's an ongoing conversation and an ongoing coding of the religious motif or the religious act of worship, that are well established. These rituals, though changing in scale, as you mentioned, are ancient, and they're done alike by, the single pilgrim at the water bank as they are by the large group of saints.
Penny, there's another question to you from Critical Geographies, if they're still around. So I'm just going to read the question, and I quote, I would like to ask Penny if the NGOization of the Narmada Bachao Andolan contributed to the rhetoric of anti-dam equals anti-nation. And are there any readings that you would recommend on this subject? Critical Geographies have I understood your question and posed it correctly. Okay, I don't know if they're here, but you can still take the question.
Okay. Yeah, I think the I think this is maybe something I'm struggling with in the project is that there is so much literature and activity around the question of displacement, specifically to the Narmada dams. Like it's 20, 30 years of writing by theorists, literary people, figures in the NGO movements, and this perspective I'm taking, I'm looking to see how it contributes or how it fits into that. Certainly may have contributed to the anti-nationalist, but I think the NGO backing really, maybe it reinforced this idea that the resistance is done by a fairly uninstitutionalized group of people. So they exist outside of the, binary of BJP Congress or the Hindu and the kind of, let's say, liberal non-believer. The NGO was somewhere in between, and that contradiction of belief in the Narmada is what united both the anti-dam NGO and pro-dam religious or political party. But yeah, I think you could certainly start with Arundhati Roy's The Greater Common Good, and there has been an immense amount of writing on displacement of people, and it's ongoing. So you could start with the essays and go to news articles published today.
Thanks, Penny. There's another question to you from Clifton Rosario. Clifton, would you like to ask the question yourself?
Yeah, hi, thanks. No, I was just curious. I mean, fascinating discussion actually, both Sarah and Penny. But Penny's, I think, subject was closer. I mean, I had occasion to spend quite a while in the Narmada Valley. I'm just curious, as to how she's looked at. I mean, if you looked at this entire question of the Adivasi communities, their culture, their relationship with the river, with Narmada, and how the entire kind of the hegemony of the parikrama, as it were, as opposed, and even in terms of dominant, discourse, as opposed to the Adivasi cultures. Was that something that you looked at or looking at? Thanks.
Yeah, a little bit. I think actually my original interest in this geography stems from like travel logs. There's some really beautiful like pieces of writing novels on people taking on the Narmada pilgrimage simply out of curiosity, nothing to do with the dams at all, or of spiritual surrender, and the description of how they intersect with communities there is quite beautiful. I think I kind of briefly mentioned it, but the Adivasi communities being, largely Bil or Gone tribes have their own entire, subculture that's really rich, quite understudied, now increasingly lost to us. But lots of ethnographers have studied them before and archaeologists have studied them before displacement occurred. But I think in terms of it, Hindu hegemonizing the landscape or Hinduizing the sacredness, this question of what we replace when something gets submerged, to say that even the language of rehabilitation and resettlement is in the term paripasu, like it's supposed to be a one-to-one replacement in a way. So if a temple gets submerged, the promise that each development corporation is expected to fulfill is that such temple is replaced pari passu in a adjacent location, or located near to the villages or the tribes resettlement. But that was almost never the case. Largely what we see is a tribal or Adivasi community's temple or religious structure gets submerged, and then its name, because it may have been made famous through pilgrimage, gets maintained, but instead of its localized specific deity is replaced with Shiva or one of the larger figures more akin to the worship of Hindu hegemony. Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure what term I'm supposed to repeat. Sorry.
I think it's related to what you mentioned about one-to-one
Oh,
substitution.
paripasu. Yeah, paripasu.
Okay.
I think there are also one or two more questions. There's one more from critical geographies, and that is for Sara. Maybe I can read it out, or if critical geographies is relevant, they want to read it. Okay, maybe I'll just read it out. And for Sara, what you said about temple construction as a facade for destruction reminded me of the work of Shivangi Mariam Raj, whose research practice on rubble we were introduced to at one of the PATIO sessions. Do you see the continuation of temple construction projects in other parts of India today? Are there any readings you would recommend? And then there's one more, so I can maybe read that out. You can take it. And then in the message in the chat, Isha Khan has asked a question. Isha, do you want to unmute yourself and ask it, or should I read it out? Maybe I can. How would you think about the economic direction and informal labor markets influencing these political movements, specifically looking at migration and seasonality of movements?
These are for me, right? Yeah. So the first question about the construction of temples. Yeah, I definitely think this is the same project. This is one project. It starts with Babri, and Babri becomes this model that has been tested once. And in fact, when Babri is demolished, the slogan that comes out is Babri to jhanki hai, Kashi Mathura baki hai, which is supposed to speak to the yearning that is produced through the movement, that this is not finished here. This is only a trailer, and the actual film is yet to come. And that's what we are probably seeing with the relentless demolitions that have been happening post 2014. Yeah, and definitely I would, I mean, I don't know if there are works that have been done about this aspect of demolition, but in terms of reading about Hindutva, one scholar who I would very much suggest is Luna Sebastian, who's written a book on Hindutva, race and caste. And I think she brings in a very novel perspective, putting Hindutva's history as a very unique history of fascism, competing with the existing models of Nazism or Italian fascism, as an innovative model of fascism. And so I would definitely suggest that. In terms of like K.N. Panikkar, as he was suggested by Stephen, is also a good scholar to sort of look at. Then there is one book called The Biopolitics of Hindu Nationalism, which is also very interesting, whose name I am forgetting. I can just look it up. Biopolitics. Yeah, Banu Subramaniam. Yeah, a very good scholar, definitely to see the very innovative techniques that Hindu nationalists have been deploying. And the second question about the immigrants, and yes, like this is what the paper is sort of also about. It is about this produced insecurity, this manufactured insecurity that comes in with neoliberalism. And the people who are most targeted to become a part of this movement, and VHP becomes this successful recruitment organization because it's going to these people who do not have a sense of belonging anywhere anymore, and not even with their own class, as we see any form of collective mobilization in terms of caste, all of those structures are vanishing, and the emergence of more and more insecure labor structures like gig economy as we see today. They become these hotbeds for Hindu nationalists to go and to recruit. So definitely it's very connected, the migration pattern and how they add to the larger flow of Hindu nationalist recruitment force. Yeah, thank you. So thank you for the questions.
All right, great. I think with that, we are also at the end of our time for today's PATIO conversation. And just as a reminder, next month we'll be meeting on the 9th of July, the second Thursday, with our theme, Tools of Building Practice. And our speakers will be Pedro Goodis and Nina Zucchi. And we'll have Vibhuti Sachdev as our respondent. And we look forward to you joining us again for the next PATIO conversation. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks again to our speakers, Sara and Penny, and respondent Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.